I'm Kimberly C. Paul. As I travel throughout each state, I realize that death is just a moment. It is how we live until that moment that matters. Finding connection with friends, family, and complete strangers. Journey with me. This is the Live Well, Die Well Tour. Thank you, Mariah, for joining us on Death by Design podcast. It was so great to meet you about a week ago, face to face. And, you really intrigued me of what you do professionally and how that intersects with end of life. But before we get started on that, tell me a little bit about how you became interested in helping individuals at end of life.
Yes, I love this question because it actually has me really go back and think about three specific influences that were so important to this journey that I've been on, Kimberly, which is really to look at grief and look at death together. And then I've really got a deep desire to help others in all things related to death. So these three influences, I call them Kanya, clients, and Karen. And Kanya was my beloved, always with me German Shepherd dog.
It's something we have in common.
You understand this devotion.
Absolutely.
And she was with me through high school, through college, and beyond for a span of a good long time for that breed, 14 years. She was my constant companion. And when she died, I was undone. By this, I mean, I was so sad. I was really heartbroken. And though appeared to be going about my very busy life with business as usual, I was in graduate school at the time in the middle of a demanding internship at a Harvard teaching hospital. And I can tell you, I pretended a lot, like a lot of people do when they're in a grief process. And during this bereavement, what was really striking to me was that my 5 brothers and sisters and my parents, they were just uncharacteristically absent. We are all quite close and engaged, yet I think this more distant retreating Mariah, whom they knew had lost her best friend, was not on the top of the back then call list. And clearly my quiet despair had an impact on my family and my friends. Now with the work I do and the training I've done, I know my grief scared them. And I can tell it scared me, and you know exactly what I'm talking about with all you have seen and heard. And this grief, it lasted for many, many, many months. And it really remains my very first clear experience of the power of grief. I learned so much about her during this period of time. And, I was left feeling and thinking like I was in the midst of a mystery. And I became extremely interested in the subject of grief and loss. The second influence came subsequently over several decades of work with clients in my weight and health management practice. Treatment that I do is long-term. And so over years of work, I've seen my clients through the best of times and the absolute most heartbreaking losses. I bore witness to the death of clients who've lost their children, their friends, their siblings, their pets. And I've just had a kind of compassion and ability to be with their sadness, which is often overwhelming. And I began to recognize and then welcome over the years that I could provide this listening to others, and that this quiet, open caring really makes a difference to those who are suffering. And that this suffering goes on for a good long time. It's not a 2-week and then it's over. No, there is not an expiration date.
I totally agree with that. Totally agree with it.
So that was number 2. And then lastly, several years ago, I lost one of my closest friends to a protracted battle with a terminal cancer. And she's not the only close friend I've lost. I'm no stranger to grief and loss on a very, very personal level. But this was something different. My dear friend lived quite near me, so I had the privilege of being front row to her thoughts and her questions and her wishes. And I joined her on this journey, and we talked a lot about how the end of life could maybe somehow be different and kinder than the experience she was having and then anticipating. And that was it. Kimberly, this was where I promised her and myself, and that was 7 years ago, that I would train and learn and open myself up to the death experience in every way possible. This was not a sacrifice for me, but a vision I held. And, well, you know how the draw of hospice,
right.
Even your life experience. I began volunteering at hospice. It's 4 miles down the road from me. I can ride my bike there. And I would go every week, and I still go for as many hours as I can possibly spare from my practice. So I'm on my 6th year now of that. I trained in grief and loss. I went to the best, the people doing traumatic grief, regular grief. And I now see clients for all kinds of sadness in loss. They've lost their pets, they've lost their people. I recently completed my end-of-life doula training, though I've been doing doula work for several years now. And I think I shared with you when we met that I'm the commissioner of the Dover Cemetery.
I love it.
so my people have a great final resting place. And then last year, and this is really quite a serious endeavor, I've been volunteering for Compassion and Choices, and it's an amazing organization that's all about expanding end-of-life choices. And I had the privilege, and really was quite an experience, to testify at the State House as someone in support of medical aid in dying. So there you got it. That's where it all happened. And I just love my work as a trusted guide for those experiencing all kinds of loss, whether it's a diagnosis or actually dying. My someday I will, that promise I made to my friend, has morphed into devoting as much time as possible to those with illness, a new diagnosis, or planning for end of life.
That's amazing. And on behalf, I'm not from Massachusetts, but on behalf of everyone in your state, thank you for expanding the end of life options. I mean, it is all about choices. And I think the more choices we have at end of life, the better we're able to meet people where they're at. And so thank you for testifying and really expanding our choices at end of life. Within Massachusetts, it's about meeting people where they are. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. A privilege, really.
So really, your practice, you mentioned it earlier, that you work with people who tend to overeat, and probably have a lot of other complicated grief when it comes to that. What I'm finding is throughout my years is that grief seems to be bubbling up in a lot of different ways. Anger, overeating, and to the point that some of us, are dealing with it very humanly by trying to numb it out. And so talk to me a little bit about how you see certain habits of ours as being human and how that intersects with grief.
Yeah, so, if I think to just answer the question with respect to the link between overeating and grief, maybe, or using food and grief, the backdrop is that when I started my work in treating overweight, which was almost 38 years ago now, our country was about 20% overweight, and it was not a worldwide epidemic. Now our country is 73% overweight, and it is a worldwide epidemic.
Holy cow. That's insane.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to just say is that if one is, if you're not struggling with your weight, you're the minority. And man, you got some kind of magic going on, because this is an environmental situation to begin with. We did not have a gene change and morphing to this percentage of overweight in 38 years. So the good news is that there's a lot you can do about that. And yet, when one is experiencing grief and loss, it's the most vulnerable time for gaining weight. Initially, appetite might be lost because obviously, your world goes upside down.
Sure.
With whatever loss we're talking about. However, often as time unfolds, eating may be experienced as a form of solace, and it may have become that anyway. It's a learned behavior. There are certain chemical responses, never mind the taste good momentary experience, that occur with eating. So, the person who loves sweets may find short-term distraction and a bit of relief by eating cookies and candy. The person with a salty palate might seek solace in cheese, chips, and crackers, and the availability of food, it is always there. You go to the hairdresser, it's there. You go to the bank, it's there. So there's kind of a natural setup for using food for, as I just say, solace and a dopamine surge. And it's a very, very vulnerable time for just about anyone, particularly after the initial, stunning, maybe shutdown reaction.
Well, I'm from the South, so when someone dies, we bake and we bring fried chicken. And so I think that's kind of a really interesting theory of how we, bake and bring people things when they're facing unexpected grief or the loss of someone.
Yeah, you think where that came from, years and years ago, food was scarce. So the way to help someone feel better would be to bring them what would be called a treat. Not a treat anymore. It's commonplace, but the traditions remain. You want to, fill someone up who's depleted and has lost, just the metaphor of lost. I would also say that, grief, sadness, shock, all incapacitating experiences. So this is just another sidebar where my work really rises to the front and center, and it's kind of paradoxical because during grief and loss, self-care can become very difficult. Healthy eating and exercise can fall completely out of reach, not just as the environment change with people bringing things over all the time, but certainly you and I could both speak to just the loss of energy and motivation and initiative when one has been, slayed by loss. And what I've found in this area with my clients, they actually experience a return to power when they're focusing on their weight and health, because as the world looks extremely bleak, managing food and managing exercise may be one area that they're in control of when everything feels out of control.
Wow. That's crazy. But it makes totally sense. I mean, totally sensible to do that, something like that.
So I got to just tell you one story that just really brought this home to me. And this was probably midway in my career treating overweight. I had a client I'd been with for a couple of years, I was very close to, and her daughter had a riding accident. And she was a professional rider, and she hit the fence and suffered a catastrophic injury. She lost brain function. And this family, oh my goodness, they were in, I think, Virginia at the time, and I'm in Massachusetts. And this client spoke with me almost every single day during bringing her daughter off life support, getting her health back to as good as it could be. And yet her daughter had written a will, and she had expressed her wishes, and she was literally a vegetable. So this family had to follow through with her wishes to withhold food and water and enter life. She was on a feeding tube. And I thought for sure, this was just more than anything I had ever experienced. And I had no expectation that my client would continue with me, and she did. And we continued our work through the death of her daughter. And that was another experience where I could hold the space for her with all that she was going through and help her to be in control of this area of her life, her weight management during this time where it was beyond out of control.
Wow.
That was quite a learning opportunity for me, and an opportunity in just so many ways.
I never really thought about it as a certain aspect of our lives that we can control. But when you eat better and you exercise, there's just some chemical things that happen in the body that make you even feel better.
Yes. Well, certainly number one form of depression. I was so surprised when I was an intern in one of my training programs years ago. I was a runner at the time, and I was asked if I would develop an exercise program for people with clinical depression. So the link between exercise and depression has only become clearer and clearer. And when one is so reasonably depressed, let's say, through loss and grief, being able to move just allows for something else to happen.
Yeah, and that means when you want to lay in bed and have that, glass of wine, it's like get up and go around the block and exercise. And it's really interesting, the sugar that tends to be addictive in some of the things that we're even talking about. So it really is a chemical balance, and I totally agree with you. When I exercise and get moving, I totally feel a lot better. But let's talk about this new movement that you just happen to be a part of called a death doula. It's one of these movements that's happening throughout the United States. A lot of people are still unfamiliar with it, and
Yes.
I love it. I call them Sherpas, but I also love to hear people's explanations of what death doulas, death Sherpas do in this field. So tell us a little bit about what you are doing within this death doula movement and the services that you assist individuals with through this service.
Sure. So my end-of-life doula trainings with the International End-of-Life Doula Association. It's called ANELDA for short, INELDA. And ANELDA has been at the forefront of doula training in the United States. It's, as you say, it's a very new field. But and I actually chose to train with ANELDA because they have a gorgeous model that makes so much sense. So I'll go through the 3 phases of the work, just touching on the highlights of each phase. So the work is done with the dying patient, if at all possible, and family. And each of the 3 phases reflect a very thoughtful, loving, guided process before death, during death, and after death. And I always feel as an end-of-life doula, if I can provide this framework through all 3 phases, I am just going to be with a group of people who are going to have just an amazing experience of dying. My goal, or our goal, is to have a death process that honors the wishes of the dying person, and that he or she has a voice and has an end-of-life plan if able. And I say if able because sometimes you're called in when the family is very engaged, but then the person dying is really not able to function in a way that you can get a lot of work done. And what's also wonderful about this model is family and close friends and even caregivers are all encouraged to be involved in any part of this 3-phase process. So phase one is called creating legacy. My goal in this phase is to have all, especially the dying person, be in touch with their place in the world. So you think about that. End of life, the person is dying. They're cogent or semi-cogent. And they get to think about how they got to where they are. What were the experiences that shaped their life? Who influenced them? What events might I like to describe or note as meaningful? And oh my goodness, and Kimberly, I'm sure this resonates with you as well. End of life, relationships and experiences with people loved is the most important of everything.
I totally agree with that. I mean, and connection, it's that,
yes.
that vital connection you have within those relationships. And, some of those relationships aren't the best, but it's like you weathered the storm. It's yes. Makes those relationships even richer than those who have walked away from long-term friendships because it got hard.
Yes. And sometimes those long-term relationships, there are regrets because people haven't perhaps forgiven or thought that, hey, being in a long-term relationship means you have breakdowns. That's part of the history. That's the fabric. So often in creating legacy, you can see people reconcile some differences. You can achieve a whole level of communication that wasn't available before this clock was ticking. So it's a gorgeous time. And then there's all kinds of representations of life and a personal legacy that can come to the forefront. So there can be letter writing by, people in the family, by friends. There can be, letters that one might want to hold on to forever, read and given, exchanged. There can be favorite items that are brought into the space where the dying person is spending their time. that just representations of a history, a memory, something that was valued, that is not lost, that is very much in place. And there's a place during legacy work for, as I say, family and friends to participate. So it can become very creative, very loving, and can be really a new landscape where kind of the circle of sadness that people are spinning in only faster and faster. In addition to that, there can be this legacy work that just is such a reminder and so rich in expression. Mm. So that's the first phase. The second phase is called sitting vigil. So sitting vigil is when we guide the patient and the family through the last days. And we're always working with a team that's already in place as well. So if it's hospice, there's the nursing staff, social worker, a spiritual guide, whatever. But this is a time, and it begins before, well before active dying, hopefully. It's a time where we acknowledge death. We really want our person to die in the best possible way, where loving comfort is everywhere. There are times also, of course, naturally, where families are very worried. So they may be worried about what it looks like or what certain symptoms mean. So along with staff, because end-of-life doula, we are not medical people, but we do know and recognize different phases of dying. But we can work with staff to help reassure families as to what's normal in terms of symptoms, in terms of what next to expect. I really see my job is to help take as many worries away as possible. And again, some of the more challenging times for families is when there are symptoms and signs of struggle and the body breaking down. I think the summary of sitting vigil, and it can be hours, and you may have to tag team with other people because people, this could be 2 days, this could be 3 days, 4 days. But we are really integrating into what's already been established or not. We're aware there's a lot going on during this time of pre-death and active dying, that there may be religious rituals to support that really ground people. And ultimately, my end game is to throughout be a calm and reassuring process during death.
Wow. And that's sometimes this stage is really perfect for the death doulas, because many people that we have been close to throughout the years tend to turn away during this time. Mm-hmm. And so the death doula plays a very vital role to remind the patient as well as the family that this is just a normal process.
Yes, it is, yet one that probably takes everything you've got to stay present to.
Absolutely.
So there's an interesting, I don't like that term really, there's just such a respect for wherever anyone is in the family. And I never try to help people feel better or you shouldn't feel this way, whatever. Everything goes. And that's the trick and the art and the science of being a guide, is that I have in my mind where I'm going and then how I'm going to get there with this group of people going through this event. That's where then the artistry comes in.
That's beautifully put.
So phase 3 is called reprocessing. And, it's a kind of a clinical term, but it's really a regroup with family and friends and maybe caregivers to acknowledge and process what has just happened. It can take place 1, 2, 3 weeks post-passing. I would prefer to do it earlier rather than later, because the story of the death that we've all shared is very, very much in the forefront. And each person may be remembering their story differently. There may be uncertainty or worry or peace. We hope more peace over how that person died. But I think the other kind of anti-cultural part of the reprocess is that in this regroup, we really acknowledge the grieving process. And this is where my expertise is a little more extended beyond the realm of end-of-life doula, because end-of-life doulas do not necessarily do the long-term work of grieving. It's really just, this is exactly what the term is. It's a reprocess of the death event. And then often people are referred out if they're willing and interested in getting more support.
Wow. Now, this is the interesting thing that some individuals, this is such a new field that, the question is it expensive to have a death doula at the bedside? And I loved your explanation when we were working together back in, right outside of Boston. But you said that, it could be a sliding scale. Some doulas do it per hour. But tell me a little bit about what is this expense to have a death doula at the bedside?
Sure. And I think you're going to see, even if we were having this conversation next year, there's going to be a different conversation about it.
Right. It's evolving.
You got it. And right now there's no third party reimbursement. So where end of life doulas are most commonly found are in hospice, often part of a hospice program, being integrated into a hospice program, maybe not all 3 phases, depending upon the training, but definitely you'll see their presence in hospice programs. Is often it's a volunteer position, although I'm hearing now more that hospices are making a place for, a bona fide salary position for their end-of-life doulas. The other place that you'll find end-of-life doulas are in private practice. And again, this is the charges for this is quite varied. So, in private practice, you're not going to third party bill for your services. Personally, I've been very, very, very fortunate in being able to have a very solid other business. So any grief or end of life work, any work in that domain, I say I'd never want you to not come because you can't afford it. So whatever someone can pay, and generally I'll say $25. That's perfect. And, that's then and I think there are, people like myself who are very flexible about making their services in this way a service.
Nice. And, we talk about, well, wow, it's not a third party reimbursement stream, but you don't come with all those restrictions and being told what to do. You're able to meet the family exactly where they are and allow the family to guide you to where you're going to be with no restrictions.
Yes. And this work, again, I'm already speaking with someone who's walked this path, there is such a spiritual component to this work, and however one might define spiritual. Spiritual, to me, in this work, it is not of this world. It is some other consciousness that I know I bring to it. I feel I'm in the presence when people are talking about their mortality and having the myriad of reactions and experiences to confronting whatever element of that they are, that I am in the presence of something so sacred that, it's difficult to even think I'm now going to charge you for this.
Right.
So, people are obviously needing to make a living, and that's, there's a fee for service. But I think that I've just been finding from my practice, this work sits in a very different place than my weight management work.
Wow. Now, so you guys, you mentioned earlier you do conversations with people on Skype and via phone. I mean, how does someone find you to work with, whether it's, through a guide, whether it's, trying to help people find a death doula in their area, or with just grief as a therapist?
Yeah. So my work has always been word of mouth. It's just a great built-in control for good work. And this is a area of life that affects everyone. So, I I stopped at the pharmacy yesterday and I ran into my son, he's 22, and it was his middle school tutor. And she said, "Are you still doing your grief work?" I said, "Oh, yes, of course." And she began to tell me of this amazing position she and her family were in, to have a woman who was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, I think it was. I sometimes don't even remember the names of the cancers anymore because it all's the same. You're in the space of it. And this woman has been living in their house. She's an extended family member while she's going through a trial treatment for what is a terminal cancer. And the patient's extended family had just arrived from Ecuador.
Oh,
living in.
wow.
Yes. And she said, I just, this, and she began to just tell me everything that was happening in her world. And I said, look, you know my number, call me anytime. And so that, there's so much good work that I could do with this system.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so often what happens. It's word of mouth. I do have a website, mariahriess.com. So people can always find me there. And I'm Mariah in Dover, Massachusetts. So if you Google me, you'll find me.
Awesome. That's not only, you're doing so much end of life work in your community, whether it's, being a longtime volunteer at your local hospice house. And now you're even kind of running a death cafe, which is a little bit different than kind of the death cafes out there. But you wanted to have space for people to, allow people to, the event to evolve into whatever it's supposed to be. So tell me what's going on with this death cafe you're doing.
Yeah, so I'm just right now getting the word out. I'm going to have an event in my home, which I hope to have as a regular event. The background thinking, Kimberly, for me is that we're generally uneasy talking about death. And we're afraid of death. And we're afraid of grief, our own and that of another. So death cafes have been done in over 66 countries in the world. And there are they're in the tens of thousands of people who have attended them. So I'm hoping to create a space where people can come, not a bereavement group, not a clinical treatment program, but a place where we can actually talk about dying. And when you think about the levels at which people have experienced death, I know when I do grief counseling for pet owners, I hear about the most significant people in their lives whom they've lost. They spend more time on that than the pet often in the first few sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a place where it's becoming a different kind of comfortable with the fact that we're dying, that we've all been touched by death, that by the time you reach 30, you've probably been touched by something more on the catastrophic side. And I'm sure that our conversations will also morph into just the what's happening in our medical system, the resistance to restraint, how people have their stories of facing impossible success medically, watching others face impossible success medically, yet being treated. And I think even the conversation that it's easier to offer treatment than to tell someone about how they will die, we might be able to actually impact people, getting their own hands on the dials and controls of their own end of life. If they could plan for their own deaths better. We won't get into this now probably, but there are several documents and one must have in place.
Yeah.
Might we treat the elderly differently when we can actually do more than a toe touch on the fact that someone's life is ending? The medicine of hope, in our death cafe, I'm sure we'll talk about that. There's just so much that we can touch on that will just allow people to settle down a little bit about their mortality. And if nothing else, be around others who are grieving in a way that isn't averting eyes.
There's a lot of connection in loss and grief. And there's a lot of courage in looking at your mortality on a daily basis that really brings you to what's important. And it's this moment that we all need to be present in. And, throughout this Live Well, Die Well tour, what's amazing to me is you have community members like yourself who are becoming my, everyday heroes. You don't see them on large stages or, best-selling books, but the work that you are doing in your community is radically changing how people look at death, it will experience death, and how we're going to normalize it. And to me, that is the important grassroots work that I'm trying to do. And it's so nice to be doing it beside people like you, who are just doing what is right and what they're called to do. And I thank you for that.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. And I, just to get a little more on the concrete side, I would just so recommend that people become informed on all things death. And I can certainly provide one of my favorite resources. But before even saying that, I'd also, number 2, complete documents that outline your preferences, your living will, your healthcare proxy, your DNI, your bolster. There are 4. Very important to take that on and to discuss wishes with family.
Yeah, the conversation.
The harder things. And if you look around, go into your local newspaper, there's so many resources now being put toward this and at a community level where these conversations are opening up, and to just be in the space. And then I would just also want to add, and again, this is another whole topic, Kimberly, but navigating final stages of life includes a natural grief, And, for anyone listening to this podcast and going to going to your sessions, it's normal to resist everything we're talking about. It's normal to feel off balance. And the more you kind of maybe sit in the space of these conversations, to feel afraid, to feel sad, it's almost like a gate to go through, because this is ultimately a reflection of a life alive, a life you like or don't like, but you really want to keep it.
Right.
So I would just, to all listeners and anyone toe-touching on this conversation, keep at it, because if you do, there's an appreciation, as you just said this, there's an appreciation for your life that will grow. This I know. Yeah.
Mariah, I can't tell you. I mean, meeting you now, calling you a friend, and now working together, it's just one of those things that I'm so grateful to cross people's paths like yourself, and then for you to turn around and share it on a podcast that is truly owned by the community. I really do appreciate your time. And can you give us your website one more time?
Yes, it's Mariah, MARIAH, Riess, RIESS.com.
So another resource for those who are listening on this getting ready to start season 4 of Death by Design podcast. We know people are interested, and all we have to do is keep learning, be students. And I believe the more we learn, it might lessen our fear, but it's just a human reaction to the unknown. So Mariah, thank you for your time. And I tell you, until we meet again, my listeners, Death by Design podcast is out there. Join Mariah, contact her if you have any questions. But Mariah, thanks again for who you are in your community and providing me just guidance in my own journey as a professional. So thank you for your time.
A complete privilege, Kimberly. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. And remember, you're the designer. This podcast is produced by Jason Andre with 7 Season Films. If you're interested in telling your story,